So I guess we'll get started. Thank you for joining us today. I am David Borden, Executive Director of StopTheDrugWar.org. I'm going to apologize in advance if there are some momentary delays here and there. I'm having to use another person's computer that I'm not familiar with to have the right connection for the video. This event is Human Rights Challenge, Judicial and Extrajudicial Drug War Killings in a Time of Authoritarianism. Actually, let me first, I'd like to recognize, our speakers. We have Professor Jason Wright of Washington and Lee School of Law, I'll read his full bio when Jason's ready to speak. It's quite impressive, and we appreciate your joining us today. We are hoping that Agnes Callamard, the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary killings, will be able to join us by Skype. She has had to deal with an emergency that may prevent her from joining. She's hoping to. We'll see. We have on Skype Justine Balane. Did I pronounce your name correctly, Justine? Can you? Okay. I'll see if I can turn up our volume. Okay, Justin is representing Akbayan Youth, which is affiliated with the Akbayan political party. Our co-sponsors today are all NGOs. We have the Asian Network of People Who Use Drugs, Dianova International, who also helped us secure this room today, for which we're quite grateful. The Ecumenical Advocacy Network on the Philippines, FAAT.net, French Alternatives on Addiction and Toxicomanies, Fields of Green for All, the Filipino American Human Rights Alliance, Help Not Handcuffs, Housing Works, the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, Netherlands Drug Policy Foundation, the New York NGO Committee on Drugs, the National Ecumenical Interfaith Forum for Filipino Concerns, Northern California chapter, REDUC, Brazilian Harm Reduction and Human Rights Network, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, the United Methodist Church General Board of Church and Society, and the Zimbabwe Civil Liberties and Drug Network. And in addition to our speakers, I think we are going to have some brief comments, representatives here from the International Coalition on Human Rights in the Philippines, as I mentioned, is one of our co-sponsors, and Akbayan Youth. With that, I am excited to report that Senator Risa Hontiveros was able to provide a video for our event. They weren't sure if she'd be able to in time due to travel, and we will begin hearing from Senator Hontiveros, who also represents the aforementioned Akbayan Party.
To the participants of today's UN side event in New York City on the war on drugs, hosted by StopTheDrugWar.org, I'm Risa Hontiveros, a senator from the Philippines and from the Democratic Left political party Akbayan. For the past 2 years, our country has been the center of attention of the international community because of an abusive and corrupt war on drugs that's being implemented here, claiming more than 20,000 lives in the latest count so far. The president's authoritarian leanings are compounded by his license to kill public pronouncements. I'm consistently called for the suspension of the war on drugs, the centerpiece program of this government. I filed a bill in the Senate that presents an alternative to the problem of drug addiction and drug use, one that is hinged on a public health approach and anchored on human rights. This proposal may continue to fall on deaf ears given the current political situation. President Duterte has lost the war on drugs, just like those who have implemented the same inutile policy before him, to the detriment of so many lives and families, mostly poor, and resulting in the wasteful use of taxpayers' money. Adjusting to research and evidence on the inefficacy of the war on drugs is not the strongest characteristic of Duterte's empty machismo. The role of international solidarity is crucial now to the lives of the Filipino people. We need to sustain the global attention on the human rights violations in the country and to continue to pressure the Philippine government to open up its drug war operations to independent investigators. In the areas of health, rule of law, social justice, peace, and strong institutions, much needs to be rebuilt in the Philippines. But hope persists in the Philippines. We build on that hope.
So we are quite grateful to Senator Hontiveros and her staff who created this video as a last minute request. I will. I hope that Justin is. I didn't disconnect Justin. I wonder if I may have. Okay, Justin, just making sure we still had you connected, so so you could hear. Now it's after midnight your time. Do you need to go first, or can Professor Wright speak first?
If it's all right, I can go first. If that's all right.
Okay, I'll just make some brief introductory remarks. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. First, for anyone who is comfortable answering, how many people are here at the UN for the Sustainable Development meeting? Okay, good. And how many people, again, if you're comfortable, came here through drug policy? Okay. Thanks for joining us. So for anyone who isn't familiar, the UN meeting last week and the first half of this week is called the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. These meetings are happening each year as part of a major UN project called the Sustainable Development Goals. Hundreds of goals falling into 17 categories. Roughly speaking, the SDGs seek to solve all the major world problems by the year 2030, or to do as much as we can. Some of the goals being focused on in this year's meeting are in areas like clean energy, water and sanitation, livable cities, forest management, and so forth. Now, in drug policy, of course, most issues relate to each other in one way, in some ways. We see a few of the goal areas as being particularly relevant. Goal number one on poverty. These are you see these symbols like this all over the UN if you take a tour or have a pass to enter. Goal number one on poverty. Goal number three on health. Stopping the spread of AIDS. Ending AIDS by 2030 is the stated goal. That requires addressing issues like injection drug use. Goal number 8 on on work. Number 10 on inequality. We're concerned with the mass arrests taking place in this country that leave millions of people with criminal records that make it hard to get jobs. These are just some examples. It's fair to say that those of us in the reform community see a great deal of tension between the current drug control framework and achievement of some of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now that's a larger issue, and I'm speaking only for myself and my organization. Our speakers today will speak for themselves. But this event today is the third in a series. The other two were at the UN in Vienna, Commission on Narcotic Drugs meeting. The first of which in March of last year featured a video presentation from Vice President Leni Robredo of the Philippines. Unfortunately, allies of President Duterte attacked Robredo for doing this. They argued that she had coordinated the release of the video with other events that took place that week as part of a campaign to destabilize the government. And they succeeded in starting a drive to impeach the vice president, thankfully an unsuccessful one, but it had an impact on the debate. So this leads to the other goal that we in drug policy see as having a lot to do with what we work on. Goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. In drug policy, and our work at the UN started a couple of years before Duterte was elected, getting ready for the April 2016 UN General Assembly special session on the world drug problem, or UNGAS. And we and many other NGOs from the US and around the world promoted a platform on advocating progressive approaches and emphasizing health and development and so forth. And something that we argued in one of our contributions in a sign-on statement was that when drug control objectives, including provisions of the UN drug control treaties, are in irreconcilable conflict with obligations under human rights treaties, that the human rights treaties take precedence, according to the Charter of the United Nations, which is the world's supreme treaty. Now, unfortunately, 2 months after the UNGAS, well, that's my opinion. All politics and government is complicated, but 2 months after the UNGAS, President Duterte was elected president of the Philippines. He had promised in his campaign to kill hundreds of thousands of drug addicts and drug sellers, which he claimed would solve the drug problem within 6 months of his taking office, or he would resign. The death toll estimates vary, but according to the government, in a statement, oddly, of the Duterte administration's accomplishments, there were over 20,000 killings as of March of this year. Now, the exact nature of what happened and whose fault it is, or what the government is doing about it, that's all contested. And we'll know more about this, I'm sure, from Justine. I think that's what I wanted to say to start us off. And so we'll move on to Justine Balane, the International Secretary for Akbayan Youth in the Philippines. Justine works with youth groups in the Philippines to fight for human rights amidst Duterte's war on drugs. He also serves as ambassador for Students for Sensible Drug Policy in the Philippines, and he's a graduate of the University of the Philippines at Cebu. So Justine, thank you for joining us so late at night in Philippines time.
Thank you for getting me on the panel as well. And good noon to everyone in New York.
So, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. Hello, again, I'm Justine from Akbayan Youth in the Philippines, and I'm also the Ambassador for Students for Sensitive Drug Policy in the Philippines. And I'm going to share about how Duterte's drug war undermines democracy in my country, and how the youth and children are bearing the brunt of the drug war storm. The week that the Philippine government congratulated the Thai government and celebrated the rescue of the Thai boys trapped in a cave was the week when the government's deadly campaign against drugs killed a 4-year-old boy in Cebu City in the Philippines. The 4-year-old boy was named Skyler Amatayo, and he was just learning how to ride his full mate when he was killed by a stray bullet that pierced through his heart while he was in his room doing his assignment. He was caught in a crossfire in a government hunt for people suspected of drugs. The cases, including Abatayo, is ironic as Duterte's early campaign was much touted to be a protection for children and the future generation against what Duterte and his allies would call the drug menace. But as of April 2018, reports test that 74 minors have already been killed in police operations and vigilante-style attacks, according to the data from Philippine-based Children's Legal Rights and Development Center. These minors who were killed, they either targeted in police operations, they were either killed in vigilante-style killings, or caught in a crossfire in deadly drug hunt operations. The stories include 12-year-old Justine Balane, who was just attending mass with her mother when she was shot. 4-year-old David Borden, whose father was a drug suspect. She was shot in the back during a police operation. And as his father was speeding away from the police, she was on the motorcycle and she was unfortunately shot. There were also 2 minors in Maguindanao. Maguindanao is a depressed area in the southern Philippines. One was an infant and another was a teenager, and they were killed on May 2017. Now, President Duterte is known to tag these deaths, especially of minors and children, as collateral damages fit his drug war narrative. Now, I think it's important to stress that President Duterte will have the State of the Nation address on July 23, 2018. This war on drugs then will enter its 3rd year. But the public continues to be hounded a program called the #RealNumbersPH, where they show what they say are accurate government data that in which the figures are different from what is shown in media operations and what is reported by human rights groups. But several journalists have criticized these government data because some of the terms and numbers were adjusted so that the killings that have happened in police operations would be significantly reduced. And so these government data relied so much on semantics and different legal terms in order to cleanse and sanitize Duterte's drug war. But different academic organizations and universities have come up with a project that would study and analyze trends and patterns of the drug war. We have released this last month on July 26. It's called the Drug Archive Philippines, and it's a project between De La Salle University, Ateneo de Manila University, University of the Philippines, and Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. And it was a project that studied and analyzed trends and patterns from news reports involving drug war killings. And one of the theories that have been highlighted in this report was that government drug war operations may have involved vigilantes. So in this report, they have observed that the killings arising from police operations and killings arising from vigilante-style incidents surged and dropped in cases at the same time. depending on pronouncements from the Duterte administration. So one of the cases that they've cited was in January 2017, after the death of a foreign businessman named G.H. in a drug-related case. The drug war of the Philippine government was suspended for a time, and the cases of deaths from police operations and from vigilante-style killings were said to have dropped too. And in March in the same year, when the drug war was reactivated, it surged again, with 10 dead on the next day. So this really highlights how the suspicions of some groups that government operations may involve vigilante-style killings, and these vigilante-style killings have ended up on headlines in the world all over, where people are gruesomely killed. Sometimes they're wrapped in plastic, sometimes they're wrapped in duct tape, and they have different wounds. But the most stark signs that are left for them are cardboard pieces, cardboards where it says, "I am a drug pusher, don't be like me," that have believed to have sprouted as soon as President Duterte took power. And this could also be a damning evidence of how some cops may have moonlighted as vigilantes. There have been news reports that in October 2016, in Oriental Mindoro, there have been cops that are caught, named Senior Inspector Magdaleno Pineda Jr., Inspector Marson Alderanes. They've been caught moonlighting as vigilante killers, but according to an editorial by Inquirer 2017, although they have been removed at the time, they have been reinstated with their ranks untouched. Some developments too. The Supreme Court has demanded an explanation from the Philippine government on the thousands of deaths involving the drug war. But this was before the Chief Justice was ousted through a quo warranto petition. I'm quoting a report from Rappler, a news organization here. The Supreme Court took judicial notice of the 2017 year-end report of the Duterte administration, where deaths related to cases of illegal drugs and internal cleansing conducted within the Philippine National Police are counted as accomplishments. So according to the Supreme Court, basically is asking the government for data on the drug war, explaining why there have been an average of 39.46 deaths every day from July 1, 2016 to November 27, 2017. This was a total, according to the Supreme Court, a total of 20,322 deaths during the Duterte administration's anti-drug war. But despite all these cases, people are already fighting back. President Duterte's satisfaction ratings have dropped, according to the social weather survey, days before his State of the Nation address. So what we're doing, civil society organizations, human rights organizations, are basically reforming government policies at the local level. This month, we have invited local government leaders to take and train them into the harm reduction approach to solve drug-related issues in their community, shying them away from the approach that the Duterte administration is promoting, wherein they wanted to basically kill people suspected of pushing or using drugs. Our organizations have also provided intervention for families affected by the drug war. There have been interventions in terms of giving them psychosocial help, giving them legal help in order to attain justice for cases, especially involving police-sanctioned deaths. And at the same time, from my level, we have been mobilizing and organizing young people to learn more about their human rights, and at the same time, to be more aware of the drug war killings that has been happening here in the Philippines. So those are some of the cases and progress that has been happening here in the Philippines, and goes to show that the drug war really undermines democracy.
Was that your conclusion, Justin? Okay. Now we can go two ways. We can take any questions for you from the audience or panelists, and then you can log off and get some sleep, or we can go on to Professor Wright and then have question and discussions that include both of you. What's your plan?
I can stay throughout. I'd also like to hear the discussion from Mr. Wright.
Okay, good. Jason D. Wright is a trial lawyer, international law expert, and a decorated combat veteran of the United States Army, where he served in the U.S. Department of Defense as a military public defender in Europe and in Guantanamo Bay on the 9/11 Capitol case. As a first attorney, JAG, in pronounced JAG or JAG? JAG. In United States Army history, to serve as aide-de-camp to a division commander in combat. Wright in Iraq advised on international law, national security law, and the laws of war. Wright was rated the top defense attorney in Europe among his peers and won first place in a national trial advocacy competition sponsored by the New York City Bar Association. Wright clerked for the Army's Office of the General Counsel in the Pentagon, as well as at Rocket Docket, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. Wright is professor of practice at the Washington and Lee University School of Law, where he has directed a clinic in international tribunals and is the founder of the Wright Law Firm, PLLC, in New York City. He graduated cum laude from George Mason University School of Law and holds a master's degree in international human rights law from Oxford. Wright is a major JAG in the Army Reserves and holds a top secret security clearance. He has published and lectured on international law and national security law, and is a member of the bars of New York, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. Professor Wright appears today on behalf of the California-based organization Death Penalty Focus. Jason.
Great, thank you, David, for that introduction. And Justin, thanks for staying on the line as well and being available for further questions. As you may have heard from my bio, I have experience with war, but most of it's actually the laws of war and armed conflict, not the war on drugs, so to speak. My personal opinion here is that I think the war on drugs is a bit of a misnomer. I come from a legal discipline where you either have war or you have a law enforcement paradigm, and you shouldn't cross those two thresholds. So not unlike the situation in Guantanamo Bay, where oftentimes state actors seek to use ambiguity in their terminology, here the war on drugs appears to give a license, if you will, or some type of informal license to state actors to use some type of force within the context of the drug war. And so it's much like the war on terrorism here, and a lot of the dialogue that has occurred since 9/11. This use of the word war oftentimes is a way in which authoritarian regimes can try to pierce the veil, if you will, between the law enforcement paradigm and the law of force or laws of war paradigm. And what I mean by that in the first instance is that there's a major difference between what law enforcement officers can do and what military officers or military soldiers can do. And that when it comes to a declared war or some type of active hostilities, state actors actually have a license to kill. That's a shocking concept, but think about all the wars that have existed in the past. Soldiers kill each other, and that's called a combatant's privilege. Conversely, within the law enforcement paradigm, no police officer in New York City has the right to kill you. If you're walking down the street, that just can't happen. They're beholden to certain rules on the use of force, and that's part of which I'll be discussing here later today. But I wanted to start off first and just challenge the title of the war on drugs, to say that in the first instance, this is a way in which regimes can actually use language for their benefit, to desensitize people to think that there is such a thing that authorizes the use of force. And in the case of drug trafficking, what we're talking about here today, certain leaders from around the world are trying to use this phrase, war on drugs, and have both extrajudicial killings applied to drug traffickers and also judicial killings. extrajudicial, meaning killings outside of normal judicial process, and judicial killings, meaning any type of trial where there's a sentenced or judged death. So just a brief pause there on the terminology here. So today I want to discuss four major areas, and I'll be available for questions, of course, with Justin afterwards. But I want to address in the very first instance the governing legal framework that we're talking about here. So what does it mean to have the right to life? And also, what type of authorities can law enforcement officers use? Secondly, I want to move on to some of the facts and discuss not only the Philippines, but also what we're hearing about in Singapore, Bangladesh, and Singapore. And then present for our current purposes here in the United States, Death Penalty Focus has also asked me to address the current administration's perspective on the use of the death penalty, so judicial killing within the context of drug trafficking. Finally, I want to move on to what I would call advocacy, or where do we go from here for those individuals that are interested in pursuing some measure of accountability to stop these practices. So with that, we're right across the street from the United Nations. I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We have, of course, a basic inalienable right to life, and that exists throughout our cultures, and not only is it enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at Article 3, but it's also in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights at Article 6. Moreover, we all have the right not to be arbitrarily detained, and that if we are to be detained, it has to be pursuant to some type of judicial process or legal process. With that in mind, to go back to the laws of war paradigm, of course, individuals can lose their right to life in some circumstances in a war zone if they're engaged in hostilities. The same is true for combatants or civilians who engage in armed conflict. They can be briefly detained for imperative reasons of national security. That's not the case here when we're talking about a war on drugs. Civilians just cannot be detained for reasons of safety. They have to be detained pursuant to some type of criminal infraction. So with this question, when can a law enforcement officer, whether an officer is in New York City, is in the Philippines, Singapore, or Malaysia, when can they use force against a civilian? And we have some principles from 1990. They're called the Basic Principles on the Use of Force and Firearms by Law Enforcement Officials. And these principles have been adopted worldwide, in essence, and they are followed as a matter of custom by all nations in the world. Well, essentially, a law enforcement officer can only use firearms or lethal force in self-defense, or in defense of others who are facing some type of imminent bodily harm or serious bodily harm, to include death. It's a very basic concept, right? Self-defense. So if there's a situation where a law enforcement officer in New York City fears for his life and that an individual is raising a weapon at them and they have a belief that the individual is going to fire the weapon at the police officer is entitled to use force. And that doesn't mean the police officer has to use force. It just means that they have the right to use force if they so choose, or to protect someone else. And the same principle extends throughout the world. For any of you who are interested in reading about these concepts, I commend you to that 1990 publication. Again, it's called Basic Principles on the Use of Force and Firearms by Law Enforcement Officials. And as we know, as a matter of domestic process here in the United States and in most countries in the world, if a law enforcement officer does actually use force outside of self-defense, then they also can be subject, or they should be subject, to national prosecution as well. So where are we right now? We've heard a little bit about the Philippines and the situation that's happening here. Justin and David both mentioned that there's 20,000 deaths as a result of the current drug war there. And the New York Times has reported as well as recently as February that they've confirmed 12,000 extrajudicial killings, whether by the state or by vigilante groups. And the government themselves, in this New York Times report, have confirmed 4,000 deaths, all extrajudicial killings. In Indonesia, in July 2017, President Joko Widodo announced a policy, and I'll read it, quote, and this is to his law enforcement officers. Be firm, especially to foreign drug dealers who enter the country and resist arrest. Enough. Just shoot them. So the president there of Indonesia is announcing a state policy to shoot on sight, essentially, any drug traffickers. And as of December last year, Indonesia's own National Narcotics Bureau reported that 79 suspects were killed in 2017 under this policy, to include 10 foreigners as well. Turning to Bangladesh, CNN reports as of May 15, 2018, that the government there started an unprecedented drive to clear the streets of dealers and suppliers. From May 15, 2018 to June 5, 2018, there have been 130 individuals killed by police and approximately 12,000 individuals detained pursuant to this so-called war on drugs. And in Singapore, for judicial killings, so that is through state process, the legal process, Amnesty International reports that there were 10 executions in 2017, with 17 more individuals sentenced to death for drug trafficking offenses. Now, in the ordinary course, there are some countries in the world that recognize the death penalty for certain types of crimes that may involve drugs. Now, let me turn to the United States, for instance. Those of you in the room may have heard that in March of 2018, the current administration announced a new policy for prosecutions. It has been the history of the United States, pursuant to our statutes passed by Congress and also through rulings of the Supreme Court, that any murder that is committed in the course of some type of drug transaction is eligible for the death penalty. Now, that does not mean that the Department of Justice, as the federal branch charged with enforcing our nation's laws, doesn't mean they necessarily have to pursue a death penalty case, but that it is eligible for murders being committed. Well, President Trump, and perhaps inspired by his meetings with the leaders of the Philippines and his review of practices in Singapore, announced a policy on March 19 that the White House, this is a White House fact sheet, that it will seek the death penalty against drug traffickers where appropriate under current law. Now, the emphasis is on drug traffickers. It doesn't say on drug traffickers who commit murder through the course of their conduct, but just a mere drug trafficker. And the next day, U.S. Attorney General William Jefferson Sessions produced a memo for his subordinate prosecutors at the district courts across the country. And there in this memo, it's available online if you'd like to see it, Sessions memo of March 20, 2018. Jeff Sessions identified 4 statutes, in his opinion, that may be appropriate to pursue death penalty cases against drug traffickers. And he identified a statute called racketeering, that's Title 18 United States Code 1959. Any use of firearms in connection with a drug offense, that's 18 U.S.C. 924J. And then controversially, he resorted to what's called the drug kingpin statute, which is available at Title 18 U.S.C. 848E. And they're traditionally, again, a drug kingpin, which is defined as an individual who generates revenues in excess of $20 million a year through drug sales, or it transacts over 600 grams. Traditionally, if a drug kingpin is engaged in conspiracies where individuals are murdered in connection with drug trafficking, the Department of Justice has been able to pursue death penalty cases. Think about the situation of El Chapo, Joaquin Guzman, who's located just a few blocks from here at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. I don't think few would dispute, for those individuals who are supportive of the death penalty, would challenge the Department of Justice general authority, legal authority, to pursue a capital case against him, just for example, based on his alleged complicity in the Sinaloa cartel. What's controversial about the current administration's current plan is that they are encouraging U.S. prosecutors to pursue the death penalty against mere drug traffickers who do not engage in murder, who have no blood on their hands, if you will, with any homicides. The Death Penalty Project has reported that since the passage of this 1994 bill, which allowed for, at least in theory, some of these prosecutions, that there have been 20 death eligible cases that have been brought forward in the United States for drug traffickers. But these cases all require some murder to have been committed. So in terms of where we are right now, we have several countries in Asia that are pursuing aggressively extrajudicial killings. And whether it's through vigilantes or through state-sponsored groups, such as law enforcement officials, it's a concerning trend. And this trend, of course, is filtered over into the perspectives of the current administration to use a legal process to pursue the death penalty against drug traffickers. As far as policy is concerned, policy arguments in support of these extrajudicial, if you will, judicial killings, is that it serves a deterrent effect. That if individuals know that there is a death-eligible penalty, or in fact that police officers will act with impunity against drug traffickers, that somehow it'll stop individuals from engaging in this trade. And we know, of course, that as a general rule, the death penalty has zero deterrent effect on individuals committing crimes. The most important thing you can do is to foster these types of sustainable development goals, to provide opportunities to individuals not to engage in these practices. But be that as it may, what can we do as advocates? And I'm sure those of you in this room are all wondering, well, what can I do, or how can I tell my friends and others to support initiatives to counter the illegal, and I'll call it illegal, extrajudicial killings that are occurring in Bangladesh, in Singapore, in Indonesia, and the Philippines. And what can I do here in the United States if, in fact, the current administration at a U.S. district court, say in Manhattan, or in Virginia, or in California, wants to try to pursue a death-eligible case against a mere drug trafficker? Well, in the first instance, let me focus on the United States. As a lawyer, I can tell you this is not going to go anywhere. Jeff Sessions and his current policy to provide is to encourage his prosecutors to pursue death-eligible cases for just drug traffickers will not satisfy current constitutional law. The Supreme Court in the 2008 case called Kennedy versus Louisiana very clearly said that first, in order for there to be a death-eligible offense, it has to abide by some type of national consensus. There has to be an agreement. And the death penalty in the United States is it's on the ropes. There's just a slight majority of individuals actually support it right now in the United States. Secondly, the crime, a death-eligible crime, has to be proportional to the actual act itself. And by that, here the court said, in the case of an unfortunate rape of an 8-year-old girl, where the death penalty was sought against the assailant, the Supreme Court said there has to be homicide for a death-eligible case. So I think if there is a charging decision by the current administration to pursue just a trafficker, to pursue a death-eligible case against a trafficker, I think that's going to be dismissed very, very quickly by a U.S. district court judge. And if it goes up on appeal, which I'm sure the administration would appeal it, I believe that the courts of appeal and the U.S. Supreme Court would be more consistent with the 2008 law. So I think we shouldn't really be worried in the United States. Certainly we should be worried about the rhetoric and how this is influencing others, and perhaps police officers and the conduct of their duties, but even national police chiefs, when faced with some of these more aggressive postures committed by the current administration, they've continued to issue proper guidance to their law enforcement officers. For instance, you may have heard about one of the tweets to go rough on individuals, on drug dealers, on criminals, treat them rough. And of course, there was a backlash from a number of police chiefs around the country to reaffirm to their subordinates, here are the guidelines for the use of force as law enforcement officers, and do not vary from that. But what can we do internationally? Well, I think Justine is certainly leading the charge. It's always the first step is to engage and participate with civil society groups. Shedding light on these issues is the first step in achieving some measure of accountability. And so I commend Justine for his work and for the work of others. We saw from Senator Hontiveros' work, do what you can to support the local legislation in the Philippines. Her national bill could go a long way if passed. Thirdly, if you see civil society groups advocating for independent investigators, such as a special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings and arbitrary detention, do what you can support those initiatives as well. The Special Rapporteur has a mandate where she is able to go into every country in the world, typically with the country's consent, to conduct her own independent investigations pursuant to that mandate. And that's another important mechanism for seeking accountability. Finally, if I could be a bit controversial here, think about how international criminal law can aid in this effort. Within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, there is jurisdiction for things that are called crimes against humanity. And a crime against humanity there are 15 individual crimes against humanity that are enumerated under Article 7 of the International Criminal Court statute. Two of those identified 15 relate to murder and relate to arbitrary detention. When it's conducted as part of a state policy or an organization's policy that is designed to conduct wide-scale and systemic attacks against the civilian population. So I would argue that what's happening in Bangladesh could clearly rise to a crime against humanity. What's happening in the Philippines could arguably rise to the level of a crime against humanity. It may be a little bit more difficult when we're dealing with Singapore because they're pursuing it pursuant to judicial killings, so not extrajudicial, but they're authorizing death penalty cases for drug traffickers. But I think there's some room for the view that there are state actors who are currently engaging in crimes against humanity. Now, this is a decision that certainly I can't make. I'm just offering one legal opinion as to a possibility. However, the UN Security Council certainly can take action here, and they have the authority under the Rome Statute to refer a matter to the International Criminal Court for investigation. So think about a situation where the UN Security Council says we're concerned about 20,000 deaths in the Philippines, and we'd like to refer this matter to the International Criminal Court and to the chief prosecutor there to investigate whether crimes against humanity have been committed here. Unfortunately, not jurisdiction through the Security Council is one way that the ICC can take cognizance of a matter. Another way is where the individual state itself is a state party. And of the country we discussed today, the Philippines is a signatory, Bangladesh is a signatory, but Singapore and Indonesia are not signatories. So the Security Council certainly has the discretion here. And I can tell you I'm working on a case right now based on a 2011 Security Council referral. I have a matter involving Libya, where Libya is not a state party, but I'm currently serving as counsel for a number of victims who had family members that are victims of extrajudicial killings in Libya. And so this is a method of seeking accountability, and against these particular state actors, I've already filed a criminal complaint in France against them. So this is also another way, is to use an ICC process to gain leverage through other processes. So not all is lost, and I would echo the Senator's words that there is hope here. International framework, I believe that there could be some mechanisms for potential redress. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jason. I'll mention that a few weeks ago, my organization released a sign-on statement. We're continuing to gather signatories for this, but 140 NGOs so far, including Death Penalty Focus, condemned President Trump's call to impose the death penalty for drug offenses. And the statement critiques his claims about countries like Iran and China and Singapore, which claim success, but it doesn't stand up. In fact, in Iran, they have essentially gutted the death penalty for drug offenses. They've made it much harder to impose, and they're bringing very few such cases at this point. And that was by an act of the Parliament. So wisdom does grow in places, perhaps before it again gets lost. So it turns out, actually, and I didn't realize this when we scheduled the event, but today is the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. There are some events across the street in UN headquarters recognizing that. Several potential speakers had to decline because of all the work they were doing for the 20th anniversary today. The ICC actually has initiated a preliminary investigation on the situation in the Philippines.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, a few months ago.
I looked and I didn't see anything official on the website.
Yeah, they've done that. We hope that there is attention paid to Indonesia and Bangladesh on this as well. But so far, that's what they're doing. And in response, President Duterte transmitted notification to the court that they're withdrawing from the Rome Statute. But people in the Philippines need to understand, and I'm really pleased that ABS-CBN is here. President Duterte has claimed that the ICC lacks jurisdiction over the Philippines because they withdrew from the treaty. So this is false on every level. The Philippines remains in the treaty until a year from when they withdrew, which means March 2019. And any crime within the ICC's jurisdiction committed up till now and through next March will remain in this jurisdiction. The treaty does not allow a country's leaders to withdraw in order to become safe for prosecution for their prior crimes. Now, we're talking about two issues here, which, as Jason noted, are not exactly the same. We're talking about extrajudicial killings in the drug war, and we're talking about the death penalty for drug offenses. These are interrelated politically, and in some ways they're interrelated as far as policy goes. We do need to be clear that they are distinct from one another and different roles apply. The ICC is not going to prosecute officials for lawful administration of the death penalty, even if some of us think because of treaties and other reasons they are not to have that. But one thing also for people in the Philippines especially to bear in mind, the Philippines has a favorable trade arrangement with the European Union. Feelings are quite strong in the EU over this. The EU officials have made clear that enacting the death penalty under law would be a red line for them. The Philippines would be likely to lose its duty-free trade. And Duterte and other advocates of the death penalty don't talk about that. But it seems like it regular Filipinos are. So keep close watch on President Trump's trade wars, because if Philippine Congress passes the death penalty, you may be starting your own with the European Union as well. I think we can turn to discussion now. Justin, Skype says that you are still with us. Here you are. I think if we do have, I think we have some representatives here to talk for a couple of minutes. We have their organizations, Filipino American groups. If you are here, why don't you start, and then we'll move into general discussion.
Should I just stay here?
I
I don't know what's easier for folks.
Either way, but if you're, why don't we turn the live stream to catch? Sure. Well, why do you come up?
Okay. Thank you for being flexible. Just be here. Hi everyone. My name is Justine Balane. I'm the regional coordinator of ITERP, which stands for International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines. It's also where my shirt comes from. we actually hosted a Stop the Killings tour that went across the country. In DC, went all the way to Los Angeles in California. And the essence of what we do is talk about what are the human rights violations that are happening in the Philippines and connecting it internationally. So the U.S. chapter actually just formed in December of last year. However, there are chapters all over the world, and something that I think is being brought up today is the importance of that solidarity work. If you can't tell, I'm also not Filipino. I'm South Asian American, and so the struggles that exist between countries aren't isolated. And so something that we do is really just talk about what are the human rights violations, particularly in these drug killings. I think we can all unite on the fact that this is not okay, that there's no justice for the folks who have been murdered. And so what can we do? What legislation can we pass? What can we really unite on? And how can we continue to have these conversations with people who may not know what's going on, or who read what's happening in the news, but then don't know how to help or how to act upon it. And so something that we do is also send folks to the Philippines to really experience on the ground what's happening, and then to report back on this is what I've seen, this is what's happening. And so there's actually going to be a community forum tomorrow being held at NYSNA, the New York State Association of Nurses, or Nurses Association, talking about people's experience from their time spent in the Philippines. And so really understanding what is happening on the ground, how is what we're talking about here relating to that, and how can we take action together. And so that's happening tomorrow, so if you'd like a flyer around that, I can provide that to you. Also next week is the State of the Nation address that's happening in the Philippines. And so President Duterte kind of talks about what are the conditions of the Philippines. And so knowing all of these numbers of the deaths and of the injustices that have happened, it's really important that we also come together and we ensure that he's telling the truth. We've talked about a little bit on how the government, Justin was talking about how the government kind of skews numbers to make it come off a certain way. And so we'll actually be gathering in front of the Philippine consulate next Monday on the 23rd to talk about the truth behind the conditions of the Philippines. Not necessarily just what the president tells us or the government tells us, because sometimes, as we said, that's skewed. If folks also have questions about what iChurch does, whether in New York or New Jersey or across the country, I'd be happy to answer those. One question that was coming up for me, which I don't know if we're going directly into Q&A, but some of you might know that martial law has been declared in Mindanao in the Philippines for quite a while now. It was supposed to end in December of last year, but it was postponed. And so in thinking about that policy around law enforcement and military, kind of what happens when martial law is declared, and how is that impacting the drug war, kind of leaving room for this war on drugs to exist. I'll also pass around some flyers for folks if you're interested afterwards.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us. And before I forget again, there are some of these sign-up sheets circulating around. If you haven't signed in and would like to, then please put your info down. If you see one of these lying around, maybe pass it along. Okay. So I was actually invited to join 2 days of Capitol Hill meetings with people on the iChurch tour back in March, and I learned a lot. And one of the things we need to keep in mind is, right now there's so much focus on the drug war killings, and numerically, by far, they are the vast bulk of them, but there are long-running problems with extrajudicial killings for other reasons, activists of different kinds, environmental, indigenous, and others, and other abuses. So, they are, even though they're still much smaller than what's going on in the drug war right now, they're getting worse, both qualitatively and quantitatively. I think it's a very dangerous situation. And, groups like ITERP are playing an important role in bringing attention to these continuing problems. So is Aaron's here today? Okay. You'd like to come up and say a few words?
Actually, I want to speak to me.
Okay.
So,
Say, can we turn the live stream camera? One person talk for a couple of minutes from that direction.
So turn it in this direction.
Yeah, gentleman over there is just going to speak briefly.
So Assalamualaikum. I'm actually a Filipino American immigrant from the Philippines. So actually, I wasn't even planning to speak today because I work with a lot of young people here, young Filipinos, and just educating them about Filipino American history and reclaiming that back, right? And so one of the things that we were seeing during in this drug war is that, for me at least, it's not really. I don't look at it as a war on drugs. I look at it as a war on poor people. It's a war on the working class people of the Philippines, because it's not only, like, as we heard already, there's so many people that are affected by this drug war. That's not even, it's not really like their children. A lot of the young people that I work with, they're seeing this in the media, and when we would listen to some of the politicians, they really do lie to us about these numbers. I remember speaking with, I remember going to a talk in the consulate with Cayetano, and he was telling us about these very low numbers of the drug war, like all of them, like I think it was 4,000, and they were like, oh, they were all drug related, but we don't believe that. That's 4,000 people, and they're all drug influencers. It's just a little bit of, it's just too far out there. So I think, like, one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that we need to start organizing our communities here, especially the Filipinos who are directly impacted by this drug war, because currently my family is well protected in the Philippines, but I know for a fact that there's a lot of families just looking into the room, there's not a lot of Phil-Ams here or Filipinos here. So I think, like, one of the conversations that we need to start doing is actually talking to the folks that are directly impacted, especially the migrant workers around, like domestic workers here in undocumented immigrants also. So these are the folks that are not, their stories are not being told. Like, they're sending money to the Philippines just to fund the government to attack our own people. It doesn't make sense. So I think, like, we've been working closely with FARA, the Filipino American Human Rights Alliance in California. And we've been having conversation and having, like, speakers from Europe, like Alistair Budit, to come speak to our young people. But I think, like, I really want to emphasize the fact that we need to start organizing, and we need to mobilize in the streets. We need to mobilize our people to speak out against this regime, against this fascist regime in the Philippines. Because I think last night there was a decision around, like, the charter change, and there was a proposal on that, and that was very. Well, first off, it was scary looking at that dictatorship is so close to happening in my country. And it started off in martial law. So it's like, we really are, I think, like, one of the reasons why I go to these events is to create allies, to really create, like, to have people that will actually take actions and don't just talk about the issue. Because as much as we talk about it, there's still so much work to be done, because our people are scared. Our people are scared to speak up about Duterte because they're afraid that their families are going to get attacked, or they're gonna get attacked by their own people because there's still many supporters of Duterte despite this. But there is hope because I've seen a lot of posts around like I'm pro Duterte, but these are the promises that he has not given to us. He promised the peace talks was gonna happen. He definitely like kind of threw that in the garbage and just they proclaimed martial law. That was a violation of the peace talks that he was planning. He promised us that the Philippines will get better, and he had this build and build and build policy but who are benefiting when we saw that 3 million Chinese immigrants came to the Philippines and started to started living in these condos and actually and taking over Filipino businesses. So our resources are already stretched enough as it is because of foreign investors. So we need to start looking into how can we actually directly help our people instead of these conversations are great, but if there's no actions behind it, it's pretty it's not as helpful.
Mm-hmm.
But so yeah, I really I guess it's a message that I really want folks to actually organize around this issue, and also please come to the Sona ng Bayan next week.
Yeah, next Monday.
Next Monday. That's it.
And are you representing an organization here today?
No, I'm not. Currently, we some of the organizations I work with, we need to talk to our membership and staff and board before we make a decision. But currently I'm speaking as an individual. But soon I hope that I'm able to collaborate with the organizations here in New York that will actually speak out against Duterte.
So let's open this up now to questions, comments from the audience.
We have one on Marshall.
Well, I know a little about it. Probably Justine can address that question better than I can. So martial law came up.
Yes, the issue with martial law in Mindanao, it was basically another manifestation of Duterte seeking to absolutize control over different areas in the Philippines. The thing with declaring martial law in Mindanao was that it was only a small city in Mindanao called Marawi that was sieged by ISIS-inspired militants. But what happened was that martial law was declared all over, and there have been cases of harassment of ordinary civilians, cases of elderly and Muslim women being stripped out of their burqas because of tight inspections and checkpoints. And these are cases that we have closely monitored, and the Commission on Human Rights have also closely monitored. And situations like these really prove that the strongman tactics of President Duterte, including the war on drugs, are ways for him to unfold authoritarianism into the country. And at the same time, we have been closely monitoring developments in Mindanao, especially that martial law was declared there and was actually extended until December this year. And while martial law is declared there, we are closely monitoring with different communities, especially those that have been vulnerable, especially those that have been tagged as terrorists, for them to know and to be able to defend themselves, to be able to be informed of their civil liberties, and at the same time be able to practice and exercise their rights.
Thanks, Justine. So we had a question over here.
I live in the Philippines, and my concern is that now the war is extending to standbys. It's gone beyond drugs. And within the last month, there was a young man arrested for not having a T-shirt on him. He was outside a store. Within 2 days in prison, he was dead. And there's a law now, not a law, but there's an advisory for arresting what they called standbys, which are mainly unemployed young people. So it's a war on poverty. I'd like to know what Justin has to say on that.
Sure, and I'll just mention, maybe also comment on this, Justin. Just in the last few weeks, several mayors have been gunned down in public. I don't know if it's clear that Duterte, whether or which of those Duterte is specifically behind. It certainly, at a minimum, seems to be a consequence of the situation of impunity. So, Justin, do you have thoughts on these two developments?
Yes. Maybe jumping off from your point about the opportunity that is unfolding in the Philippines, especially with killings of local officials. In some way, these are also connected to how vicious the drug war in the Philippines is, especially that the spate of killings of local officials have been rampant, and some of these cases have been documented by security footages. I think it also unleashed a spell of fear from among citizens. There have been rumors that out of the fears of deaths and killings of local officials, martial law may be declared nationwide. And at the same time, whenever some local official gets killed, Duterte comes on air after in public television and accuses these local officials of being involved in the drug trade. And so these are developments that we think are tactics to unfold fear into the whole population in order to justify declaring martial law and really attacking authoritarianism in the country.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Levi Bautista. I represent the United Methodist Church at the United Nations. Thank you very much for the speakers. I think as a church person, let me put some context. In the last 6 months, an Episcopal Anglican-related bishop was detained by the Duterte government. 2 Roman Catholic priests were executed at the time when they were preparing for Mass. 3 United Methodist missionaries were expelled by the Duterte government. Just about a few days ago, a missionary, United Methodist missionary from Malawi, 3 of them assigned in Mindanao at the In Peace, which is an organization related with the peace process. I think part of the context of the extrajudicial killings in the Philippines must be taken note of, which is the criminalization of poverty and the criminalization of political acts. In other words, there is in fact an ongoing insurgency in the Philippines, and the drug war provides for a cover for political killings. And I think that should not be forgotten, that in fact, the assault on the poor is an assault on the base of political organizing. And therefore, the pretext for the killing of many of the poor people, being people who are drug addicts or related to the drug trade, is a pretext for quashing, decimating a base for political organizing within democratic forces in the Philippines. So, But the larger context of that is that the democratic institutions have been so decimated owing way back to the Marcos dictatorship, and therefore the assault on the judiciary and the legislature, the co-optation of both institutions by the executive, by the Duterte government, has rendered, has therefore imperiled, I should say, political dissent. And so extrajudicial killing, detention, arbitrary arrest and detention are not just on the rise, but have been steadily happening even all the way back to martial law. The fourth item I think that should not be forgotten is the patronage of the US government of the Philippine government. And that connects Mr. Duterte with Mr. Trump, the two administrations. And we need to connect, for example, this discussion with the high-level political forum, perhaps with the Agenda 2030, which should be, and in relation to the US government, the US support for what is called the Millennium Fund, Millennium Challenge Fund, and the support for the military in the Philippines must be attached. Lastly, I think it was important for our resource persons to mention the situation of Mindanao and why martial law in Mindanao. Martial law in Mindanao provides for the context of what Mr. Duterte wants the Philippine Constitution to be changed to change the republic into a federal government. So the federalization of the Philippines provides for an easy control of political and economic warlords of specific territories, Mindanao being Mr. Duterte's area. So those should not be lost in the conversation, albeit we're zeroing in on this on the drug war. The context, the economic and political context of the Philippines and the complicity of the US with its economy and with its politics should always be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Question.
Oh, sure.
I'm just curious, what will it take before there can be sanctions coming from governments from the EU, maybe not from the United States, given the situation that we have in the Philippines? You mentioned that, yes, there is an ongoing case in the International Court of Justice, in the ICC, even if the president has mentioned that the country is withdrawing from the treaty, but that should not exempt whatever findings there would be related to his alleged crime against humanity. So you mentioned the reimposition of the death penalty as a possible issue that can prompt governments to withdraw or to impose some sanctions against the Philippine government. But maybe the government So I don't know what sanctions would be possible given the situation we have now in the Philippines, given the UPR, I think, that has findings related to extrajudicial killing of the Philippines, and the many reports related to that situation. So I would like to see any legal sanctions coming from the international community and from specific countries related to the situation in the Philippines.
We've done some work on this last November, coinciding with the ASEAN summit. We organized a sign-on statement calling for human rights conditions on some types of aid to the Philippines. But we were talking mainly about law enforcement, drug law, as opposed to trade sanctions and not even all law enforcement assistance, because some of it, we hope, you know, some of the trading helps professionalization and can reduce abuses. But there's a language in the U.S. Senate that has a pretty good chance of becoming law that would restrict funding for the Philippine drug war and requires an evaluation by the State Department. Now, I know that officials and certainly in the EU, they are careful about this because they don't want to end up harming regular Filipinos, especially if that does not then lead to steps by the government to produce reforms. And so the trade sanctions, the loss of duty-free status, for example, they're not in a rush to go there for that reason. Maybe there are other reasons too, their own business and economic interests. I can only speculate. But the death penalty is, there's an established standard having the death penalty in law. But we do feel that governments, especially donor governments, should be applying whatever pressure they can, doing so carefully. But it's international sanctions are complex matters, especially given what sanctions do to regular people. So it's something that's there. I tend to think international pressure is probably more likely to work in effect in the Philippines through impacting on the dialogue there and by providing encouragement and support that helps the opposition. That's kind of how it looks like to me. But I wouldn't want that possibility to be removed, and we do think drug war funding and cooperation, that restrictions on that should definitely be on the table. Any thoughts on this area?
Well, at least within the United States, there's something called the Leahy law that prevents U.S. funding to go towards any foreign group that commits widespread human rights abuses. So I don't know if part of that current bill also embraces some of those considerations, and that the hook is the fact that there is knowledge that the state forces are committing systemic human rights abuses, and therefore at least no Department of Defense funding should be used to advance any state security interest in the Philippines on that basis. So that might be an appropriate avenue of advocacy.
Yeah, well, I think it is being looked at in Leahy vetting, and I think the State Department did restrict some of this support. Senator Trillanes in the Philippines has raised the question of whether the Magnitsky Act could play a role as well. I haven't studied up on that act. So.
Right. I don't think that's ever been used. It's not for prosecution. But I think it's a good idea, certainly to think about the European Union. I know in the matter that I'm working on in Libya, the EU is engaged in that. Certainly not to engage in sanctions, but they are investigating the situation and eager to have more information. Some of that may be self-interested, though, because certain members of the EU do support Libya. They support one side. Some countries support one side in the civil war there. So it's I don't really know enough about European politics to know whether some countries may be supportive of the Philippines or not in regard to its policies. But certainly, I think any information that you sort of write the EU and request that they take a look at the matter. They're not already doing that.
I also I was going to say.
Just to add,
Oh, go ahead.
aside from the International Criminal Court preliminary examination of the killings and the review of the GSP Plus status, which is a trade agreement between the EU and the Philippines. There have also been overwhelming calls from the UN Human Rights Council for the Philippines to accept an independent and impartial investigation from Special Rapporteur on some executions, and that's SR Agnes Calamar. But there have been resistance from the Duterte government. The Duterte government has requested conditions from Ms. Calamar before she can step into the Philippines, and that involves that after the investigation, after the probe, there will be a national debate on television between President Duterte and Ms. Agnes Calamar, to which would compromise the integrity of Ms. Calamar's report. So, understandably, she will have to refuse the conditions of President Duterte. So, the calls of the UN Human Rights Council last month and different human rights organizations and opposition figures here in the Philippines is for the Philippine government to finally accept an independent and impartial probe on the killings from the United Nations.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that there was a statement made by a group of countries on at the Human Rights Council. I believe it's happened 2 sessions in a row now. It's actually organized by Iceland, which turns out is taking the U.S.'s place on the Human Rights Council since we withdrew from it. Costs and benefits. Did you have a question?
Since we're talking about the options to address this issue, maybe I would just like to maybe broaden a little bit the discussion, because we are talking about extrajudicial killings only in context of authoritarianism. And then we have the examples of Indonesia and Philippines, which becomes very clear to the public what's happening there, especially because you have this very strong linkage with authoritarianism. And well, because some of us mentioned the war on poverty as well, I would just like to bring to the discussion and hear perhaps some thoughts on linkage between extrajudicial killings in the war on drugs in context of very well established democracies, for example, countries in South America where this is such an excuse for police to enforce violence and cause deaths of children and families and everyone involved in the context and places and settings where allegedly drug crimes are taking place. And yeah, just to bring that up as well, because sometimes we talk only of authoritarianism in this context, and I feel like we undermine and forget these other contexts where governments are not authoritarian in any other sense in their governance, but they are very much when we're talking about drugs. And yeah, I just wanted to hear maybe from Justine and the other colleagues from Philippines here as well, if you have been in contact with movements, social movements in these other countries who face similar issues but are not that much in the spotlight just because it's part of their poverty context and has been forever throughout the different governments as a practice.
Sure. Any thoughts from either of you on this?
Well, I think the earlier comment about basically being a tool of political oppression and the war on poverty, as we've heard as well, is spot on. It doesn't require authoritarianism in order for politicians and state actors to engage in extrajudicial killings for their own political purposes. So I think that's absolutely right. As being a way in which the populace is also being desensitized through the acts of these particular leaders. So I think that's a subtle variation, but certainly it's been around for quite some time. We're disenfranchised, continue to be disenfranchised through a variety of means, to include, unfortunately, extrajudicial killings.
Other types of extrajudicial violence are part of this as well. A minister in Turkey, I believe it was, called for breaking drug dealers, drug traffickers' legs. President Trump, I don't think I haven't seen. I don't know that this had an immediate impact on police, as you mentioned. Specifically, what he urged police to do, and he was speaking to a large group of police on Long Island, was to bash suspects' heads on car door frames when arresting them. Police have a procedure of using their own arms to prevent the suspect's head from hitting the car door frame. And Trump suggested not doing that. Not sure he was talking about drug cases. So yeah, I think we should certainly. I'd like to learn more about these kinds of problems that are happening in other countries as well. It all deserves focus. Do we have more questions? Oh, so Justin.
Just a comment on that. I think also the reason why the Duterte's drug war rests on the foundation of failed drug reform policies even before the Duterte administration. So even before the rehabilitation services for people dependent on drugs have been poor and lacking and inadequate. And the concept of harm reduction isn't as developed here in the Philippines. And I guess that's also the reason why Duterte's narrative of killing people who abuse drugs is so strong, because it rests on years and years of failed drug policies, of years of stigmatizing drug use, and years of failed health services, inadequate health responses for people who are dependent on drug use.
So we had a question this side.
My name is Karen Taylor, and I'm with the Congregation Family. And one of our main missions is to end street homelessness. And I see a definite connection between the war on drugs and SDG 11, which is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So I'm wondering if you, maybe Justin, or even if there are legal ramifications that are contributing to street homelessness in the Philippines or in other areas that have the drug wars waging currently.
Well, I can address that as a lawyer. One of the great criticisms that I can offer of international human rights law is that it's terrifically positivistic for the most part. And truthfully, I'm being a bit facetious. A lot of lawyers think that they can solve problems by creating more laws. And for the field practitioners in the room, you know that's not the case. To end things like homelessness, you need to work on development and capacity building more than anything. And so my perspective on the greatest way to achieve change when it comes to economic, social, and cultural rights is really through development, through capacity building. I think that certainly there are certain provisions of international human rights law that are violated when individuals aren't afforded adequate safety and security and the like. And there are various means of legal redress domestically if the country has some domestic legislation that allows for civil rights suits or some kind of punitive sanction against individuals who deny access. Think about landlord-tenant rights here in the United States, public housing as it may be. So we do, even though the United States has its problems, we do have some degree of enforcement for individuals who have been disenfranchised through tenant rights, for example. Of course, through other legal mechanisms, you have various regional human rights bodies that do exist that can help frame international legal rights. And of course, international bodies as well. We talked about the Human Rights Committee, there's International Court of Justice for state adjudications, and the like. But I think to solve this particular problem of extreme poverty and homelessness, it's passing of the law is not going to really help. It's going to be capacity building and the sustainable development goals that are so important. I don't know if that's responsive to your question, but bottom line is laws aren't going to do it. It's my response.
I'd agree that addressing these problems, poverty, homelessness, long term, should have some impact in reducing support for approaches like extrajudicial killings. I think it's worth noting, Duterte was the mayor of Davao for major city on Mindanao Island for 20 years, with some brief interruptions during that because of term limits. And by his own admission, he operated a death squad, the Davao death squad, and street children were among their most common targets.
I just wanted to add, again, for context, the Philippines is also a semi-feudal state. So a lot of the production is from farms because it's mostly agricultural land. And so with this idea of poverty and of homelessness, there's actually the issue of landlessness. So people who are farmers and peasants who are working the land don't own the land. And you see corporations coming into places like Mindanao where the resources are so rich and the land is so rich, and corporations coming in to take over that. And so the fight between indigenous folks and folks who've been trying to own their land and live off of their land and not exploit their land is the reason that there's homelessness, that there are thousands of people who are being displaced. The Lumad have been again evacuated from their schools. They're in these gymnasiums, in these auditoriums, seeking refuge because of military presence trying to take over their land. And so I think looking at homelessness and folks who are on the street is really bringing that back to why aren't they owning land. And so it's the solution can't be other people coming in and paying for the land and then giving it to them, right? It's allowing the people to actually own their land that they live on and that they live off of, again, because of the semi-feudal agricultural state of the Philippines. And so I think just remembering that also when asking or thinking about why there is homelessness.
So Lumad, by the way, is a term for the many different indigenous groups in the Philippines, or right, it's for the Christian or non-Muslim indigenous peoples, and Moro is the Muslim indigenous. Are there any questions, comments?
Just to add on the issue of solving poverty in order to end the war on drugs, the data from the Drug Archive also supports the fact that the war on drugs is a war on the poor. According to the data, most of the victims are male, are poor, and have also been accused of fighting back and shooting back at the police, and that's why they were killed out of self-defense by the police. But what's important to note is that the highest concentration of killings in Duterte's drug war happened in Caloocan and in Metro Manila, especially in urban poor and depressed communities, where people have basically no jobs and have no safe communities and places and homes to live in. and they become prey to this drug war, wherein the police have basically been turned into killing machines, where police officers, according to some reports, have been given quotas on how many they can capture per night. So some of the solutions really to end the drug war in the Philippines is to fix long-term problems of poverty and at the same time shift the focus of the government's policy on how they solve drug dependency. That is by providing the rehabilitation when they need it and also destigmatizing the use of drugs here in the Philippines.
Question for Justine. Just to kind of like go off on what you said about like it being a class war against our people, and also that the past administrations should also be held accountable to what has happened, because as much as we keep on talking about Duterte, there's a lot of other people that we are not holding accountable from previous administrations, because this didn't just happen overnight, right? This has been an ongoing struggle in the Philippines. Poverty has been an ongoing struggle in the Philippines. So I think like how can we start, like how are you able to start shifting power from like talking about like the president, but actually talking about the people and organizing work in the Philippines? So I think that's my question, is around like how Akbayan Youth have been doing that work locally with young people and maybe also some of the adults in the Philippines. I'm not sure I got the last words or the questions. So around like how, like what kind of organizing work have Akbayan Youth been doing to shift that mentality of just talking about Duterte, but actually looking at it in a bigger picture of like previous administrations are also responsible for what has happened in the Philippines. Because Duterte is just like, we're talking about him because he's very explicit on the things that he says, and he's also very like, machismo. So now it's like, how are you, like, how has Akbayan Youth been shifting like conversations with, like, for example, like Duterte supporters? Like, how are you able to engage them and actually start changing their views, right? Not changing the views, but kind of like seeing our view of like what the drug war is.
Akbayan Youth is organizing young people, especially that a lot of them would be voting in the polls, and at the same time, a lot of them are mobilizable forces in order to stand for justice and human rights, and really stand up and defend for the rights of the families who are victimized by the drug war killings. This July, we are training young village council leaders who will be faced with different problems related to drugs in their communities, to adopt a harm reduction approach, and for them to be able to identify some of the health services issues that could be used in order to alleviate some of the sufferings or wider problems related to drugs in their communities in the first place. At the same time, we have been educating people on human rights and going out to communities in order to provide justice and support the families victimized by the drug war.
So with that, I think we are out of time for our rental of this room. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Justin, for staying up till 2 in the morning to join us. If you haven't already and would like to, we have sign-in sheets on the back table on your way out. We also have some StopTheDrugWar.org stickers. Welcome to as many as you would like. And more about our work on this issue can be found at stopthedrugwar.org/Philippines and stopthedrugwar.org/global. Thank you.
I just make an announcement.
Oh, sure, and okay.
If there are any of you who would be interested in meeting the United Nations Special Rapporteur of Internally Displaced Populations, who is a Filipino, who is based in Mindanao, Cecilia Jimenez, she's the Special Rapporteur. I'm organizing a small meeting with her. She used to work with me in the Philippines in the 1980s, but she requested me to organize a small group. Will you please give me your name and your email address? It will have to be limited to 20 people, and I'll be sending an Eventbrite discussion. It's either tomorrow late afternoon or brunch in the morning of Wednesday. But she's here speaking at the UN, but she requested me to meet with other people if I could organize one.
How do we contact you? What's reading? How can we contact? I'm sorry. How can we contact you? What's reading?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.